Today we are having a look at anticipatory grief. I'll explore some definitions, talk about the implications, and offer some suggestions to navigate anticipatory grief in your life. I'm Jo McRogers. I'm a therapist who supports grief. Welcome back, or welcome to grief support that works for the first time. It's our little corner of YouTube where we are dedicated to doing grief differently. Please like, subscribe, and turn on the notifications bell so that YouTube will know the important work we're doing here, and then they will help promote it to those who are seeking support for their grief. So let's start with a definition. Anticipatory grief is the distress that a person may feel in the days, months, or even years before an impending loss. It is the awareness that a change is coming, change not by choice. And it is an experiencing of bereavement in both nuances and in landslides as the loss approaches. It's likely that many of us have experienced anticipatory grief without knowing that there's an actual name for it. Some will hope that experiencing anticipatory grief can lessen the pain of post-loss grief, and others argue that grief before loss has no effect on grief after loss. I suggest that anticipatory grief extends and protracts our grief state, and that differing tools and strategies are needed. So who experiences anticipatory grief? It's a large spectrum of people and situations. Patients, family members, and caregivers with a terminal diagnosis. A diagnosis or progression of degenerative disease such as Alzheimer's, dementia, or Parkinson's. Individuals, family, and friends of those who've been taken hostage by addictions, mental illness, suicide ideation, or homelessness, all experience anticipatory grief as hours are spent wondering, when will their lives end? When will I get that phone call? People can't trust any other ending to all of these challenges, so they anticipate grief. Anticipatory grief is the reality for those also with hereditary disease, for those who care for children with a chronic illness, for those awaiting an organ transplant, those awaiting for their miscarriage to complete, those awaiting to birth their stillborn child, or those giving birth to babies with complications, or babies that arrived too early. Anticipatory grief happens when people are awaiting surgery, when they will lose a body part, a breast, an ovary, a foot. Pet owners anticipate grief when they watch their pet's health decline. I'm sure I've missed some sources of anticipated grief, so please comment below of which situation you have experienced and which ones have I missed. Next, what are the implications of anticipatory grief? Well, grief is generally grieving backwards, mourning a loss that has already happened. Anticipatory grief is grieving forward. It's like a grieving marathon without the end being clearly in sight. It can be exhausting, and it skews our perspective nuance by nuance. When it is a long-haul perspective of impending loss, this also extends the human ever-wishful sense of hope that the worst won't happen, that the loss has been close and yet our loved one has rallied, so perhaps they will continue to rally, and the worst that we anticipate won't happen. Anticipatory grief can be an invitation to a dangerous trajectory of false hope. The other implication to take note of is that we who are experiencing anticipatory grief are left spending extended periods of time in fluctuating fear and anxiety. When will their state change? When will they die? Will I be there when they die? Do I want to be there when they die? Do they want me to be there when they pass? How much worse will it get? Anticipatory grief is like hanging in the balance for extended periods of time with extreme emotions that are largely unrecognized because, after all, the real grief is yet to come. We largely avoid grief, and anticipatory grief has so many invitations to avoidance. According to the University of Rochester Medical Center, which is a nonprofit research university in New York, there are 4 phases of anticipatory grief that may be experienced either simultaneously, individually, but in no particular order. According to the University of Rochester Medical Center in New York, There are several phases of anticipatory grief that may be experienced either simultaneously or individually and in no particular order. The first might be accepting that death is inevitable. This phase often co-occurs with feelings of sadness and depression. The second would be feeling concern for the dying person, and this phase may express itself in the sense of regret, feeling regret over past arguments or disagreements with the person that we are about to lose. And for the dying person, this concern may translate to fear of what it's like to die, to leave people behind. And can I be strong for those around me? Often, we end up rehearsing the death as well. A person may become focused on funeral arrangements, saying goodbyes, and other concerns related directly to what will happen in the time immediately surrounding the impending death. And this can occur for both the person dying or becoming more incapacitated, and for those who are loving and supporting them. And the last one is imagining the future. Family and friends may practice envisioning what life will be like without their loved one. This phase may include visualizing holidays and other special occasions without the person or thinking about the objects and rituals that will be left behind. The person who is dying may think about similar scenarios, wondering what it will be like for their loved ones to experience life without them. And finally, the dying person may also imagine what their own experience might be like after death. What, if anything, comes next? It's important to note that anticipatory grief has largely been studied prior to the death of the loved ones or the disappearance of the person as we know them. So some early research has suggested that the preemptive processing of a loss could help a person better cope once the actual loss and death has occurred. It's also suggested that the bereaved are able to take the time to deal with any unfinished business, say their goodbyes, clarify any misunderstandings, and prepare for the social adjustments to come, thereby having a less stressful period of bereavement when the actual death does occur. However, some more recent studies argue that anticipatory grief has actually no effect on post-death bereavement. Other studies have found, however, that pre-loss anticipatory grief may be a factor in predicting a prolonged grief disorder. So at its best, the research is contradictory. This supports my belief that only you get to define your grief. So now on to how to deal with anticipatory grief. Please, first and foremost, recognize it for what it is. This kind of grief can come with lots of emotions. It's a full spectrum. Guilt, fear, and irritability. You may lose sleep. You may have problems concentrating, problems making decisions or remembering things. All of these symptoms are normal of anticipatory grief. And number two, seek support. Peer support groups are so important, either in person or online. The research suggests that narrative therapy to help recognize and reframe your experience shows up in the research as being helpful. Also, cognitive behavioral therapy also seems to aid anticipatory grief. Engaging in cognitive behavior therapy means that grief-related thoughts can be identified, processed, and then the grieving person is taught to reframe their evaluations about themselves, the world, and their future. It focuses on managing distressing emotions while encouraging actions to help a person to appreciate and experience even small moments of pleasure or joy and a sense of community or power and control. For the end-of-life patient, anticipatory grief therapy has been shown to improve the quality of their life before the death. It may alleviate depression, it can strengthen relationships, and it can bring some solace to their leaving this world. There's a lot of knowledge and a strong movement now of death positivity awareness. To seek support, you're able to just Google that, death positivity. Anticipatory grief can be a bit of a mystery because it's cleverly disguised grief through denial, diminishing, and comparison to the actual loss. Anticipatory grief needs to be recognized. It needs space and validation. It needs specialized, informed support. It precedes the following state of grief, which needs a different set of tools and awareness. But if the anticipatory grief isn't supported as forward grieving, then the task of grieving backwards will be that much more confusing and emotional. Grief before death isn't a substitute for grief later on. Unsupported anticipatory grief will muddy the next experience of grief. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. What have you learned today? What have I missed today? Please be sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell as I'm next researching complicated grief. And as you turn your attention to the anticipatory grief in your life, I send you kind thoughts, kind words, and a kind heart. Thank you, and take good care.